Imagine over 150 countries uniting against the world's superpower and openly betraying it in the most explicit way possible. Imagine yourself as the President of the United States, Trump, looking into the eyes of longtime allies like Japan, Canada, and France, and realizing they are not just ignoring your calls, they are walking away. Deals unsigned, no explanation, no return date. Trade meetings canceled. Negotiators ghosted. Markets tanked. And all of it triggered by one move that was supposed to put America back on top. That moment came on May 17, 2025, when President Donald Trump, fresh off his Middle East trip, announced what may become the most self-destructive trade gambit in U.S. history. Flat-rate tariff letters would be sent to 150 countries. Not invitations, not proposals. Instructive demands. Pay up or get punished. What followed wasn't compliance. It was a confrontation. Global markets plunged. Retailers panicked. Even America's own corporations warned, "We can't survive this." What was meant to be a show of dominance turned into a full-scale rebellion against the United States trade leadership. And maybe, just maybe, the collapse of the very leverage Trump believed he held. So what really happened when America decided to dictate trade terms to the world, and the world simply said no? In this video, let's break it down. When President Donald Trump took to the podium in Abu Dhabi on May 17, 2025, few expected him to detonate a policy bomb. But that's exactly what happened. Without warning, Trump declared that his administration would begin sending tariff bills, not proposals, not invites, but final charges, to 150 countries. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent and Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick, Trump said, would sign and distribute the letters, effectively informing foreign governments of what they now had to pay to access U.S. markets. On the surface, the explanation was blunt efficiency. "You can't meet with everyone," Trump remarked, waving away the logistical impossibility of 150 separate trade talks. But to international observers, the message wasn't about efficiency. It was about unilateral control. Bloomberg reported that even traditional allies such as Japan and Germany were completely blindsided. Many had assumed they were still in ongoing discussions, only to find themselves relegated to the receiving end of what sounded more like a tax notice than a trade offer. In the language of diplomacy, this crossed a red line. International trade depends on consent, consultation, and compromise. Trump's move did away with all three. It replaced negotiations with mandates. It bypassed complexity with brute force. And to the global community, it read less like confidence and more like a desperate move from a White House boxed in by its own failed timeline. Weeks earlier, Trump had promised scores of new trade deals. As it became clear those deals weren't materializing, the administration shifted from bargaining to billing, and in doing so, set the world economy on fire. The financial world responded not with applause, but with shock and sell-offs. Within 72 hours of Trump's tariff letter announcement, Wall Street's confidence collapsed. The S&P 500 plummeted by 5.3%, erasing roughly $1.8 trillion in market value, while the Dow dropped over 1,700 points in just 2 days. Investors, already rattled by Trump's earlier tariff push in April, interpreted the May 17th announcement as a declaration of open-ended trade chaos. Rather than seeing clarity or strength, markets saw confusion and instability. There was no detail about how the tariffs would be calculated, no process for appeals, and no clear endgame. Just a looming threat of arbitrary economic penalties across global supply chains. That uncertainty translated into paralysis. American corporations, particularly those with international exposure, immediately hit the brakes. Walmart, the world's largest retailer, issued a devastating earnings forecast, warning of price increases on over 8,000 imported products. Their executives openly revealed that the supply chain costs were rising sharply due to increased import taxes from key trade partners like China, India, and Mexico. Target echoed the warning. Home Depot delayed key inventory shipments. Construction companies froze equipment purchases. Retailers stalled new orders. The entire economy moved into a holding pattern, waiting for the next unpredictable headline from the White House. This wasn't the calculated application of pressure. It was a policy that burned down the house just to get someone to the table. And on Wall Street, no one believed it would work. However, to understand how we got here, let's rewind to April 2nd, a day Trump proudly labeled Liberation Day. Standing before a crowd of loyalists, he unveiled a sweeping tariff overhaul. A 10% baseline tariff on all imports and reciprocal penalties up to 50% on nations running trade surpluses with the U.S. The promise? To liberate American industry from decades of unfair global trade. But what followed looked nothing like liberation. By early May, it was clear that no meaningful progress had been made. Despite bold proclamations from the White House that dozens of deals were on the verge of finalization, not a single binding agreement had been signed. Negotiations with Japan, South Korea, and the European Union had stalled. The highly publicized UK deal turned out to be a hollow framework, with a disclaimer at the bottom of the document that read, "This document does not constitute a legally binding agreement." Meanwhile, the real-world impact was immediate. The International Monetary Fund reported a 1.6% contraction in global trade volume in April, the steepest since the early pandemic lockdowns. Major shipping companies began raising fees. Logistics delays increased. Cross-border suppliers panicked as new U.S. import rules created bureaucratic bottlenecks and tariff misclassifications. The Trump administration had expected nations to rush into deals. Instead, they froze, backed away, or began exploring alternatives. The result was an economic lockdown, not by virus, but by policy confusion. America had thrown up trade walls overnight, and rather than forcing the world to bend, it found itself increasingly isolated behind them. And while policymakers bickered over leverage and legacy, ordinary Americans were being quietly squeezed. The backlash from Trump's tariff blitz didn't land in foreign capitals first. It landed in American checkout lines. In April alone, the Bureau of Labor Statistics reported that core inflation rose 0.7%, with the most significant surges in clothing, electronics, and household goods. These weren't luxury items. They were everyday necessities. And the cause was clear. Imported products were now significantly more expensive thanks to Trump's new trade rules. A 2024 Congressional Budget Office study had already warned that more than 90% of tariff costs from Trump's earlier trade war were passed directly to U.S. businesses and consumers. The new tariffs didn't reverse that pattern. They intensified it. This time, the ripple effects were even more widespread. Walmart's Q2 guidance painted a devastating picture. Price hikes on core product categories would become structural, not temporary. Retail analysts confirmed that apparel prices rose 19%, home goods 14%, and electronics 12% year over year. For middle and working-class families, this wasn't a political debate. It was a direct hit to the wallet. Before we continue further, tell us, are you enjoying the video? If yes, please like and share the video and subscribe to our channel to watch more videos on the latest news stories on geopolitics, economics, and current affairs impacting your lives. At the heart of it all was a cruel irony. The administration claimed these tariffs were meant to protect American workers, but they ended up taxing American households, quietly, invisibly, and daily. And while Trump framed it as tough love, for many families already living paycheck to paycheck, it felt like being forced to pay for a war they didn't want, didn't vote for, and didn't benefit from. But it got worse. By the third week of May, the White House's ambitious declaration of 90 deals in 90 days had disintegrated into ridicule across diplomatic circles. What was initially portrayed as a strategic surge of bilateral trade victories had, in reality, produced only one widely advertised agreement with the United Kingdom. But even that deal came with a catch. Buried in its fine print was a clause that stripped it of any legal enforcement, reducing it to little more than a symbolic photo opportunity. The collapse in trust wasn't subtle. Major economies that had long been reliable U.S. trade partners began retreating, not just from negotiations, but from the notion that the U.S. was a dependable stakeholder in global trade. Talks with India and South Korea slowed to a crawl. Japan, one of the U.S.'s closest Pacific allies, quietly froze all ongoing discussions and stopped responding to updated tariff proposals. The most telling move came from Canada, which finalized a $14.2 billion LNG agreement with China, a deal that had previously been pitched to Washington. This wasn't just a rebuff. It was a redirection, signaling Canada's pivot toward more stable, long-term trade allies. Furthermore, leaked memos cited by Reuters revealed a deeper undercurrent of frustration inside European capitals. The French finance minister, Bruno Le Maire, publicly broke ranks to say what others were whispering. We need stable partners, not shifting terms on demand. The administration's gamble on strategic ambiguity had become strategic instability, and in global trade, unpredictability is often interpreted not as toughness, but as unreliability. Without trust, no deal can hold. And without deals, Trump's tariff leverage was built on sand. As diplomatic patience wore thin overseas, economic anxiety surged at home. While Trump's team projected confidence, claiming that tough talk was laying the groundwork for a great American trade reset, the private sector was already flashing warning lights. What they saw wasn't leverage. It was policy incoherence too volatile to survive. According to Bloomberg Economics, U.S. manufacturers slashed capital expenditures by 11% in April, marking the sharpest decline in business investment since the height of COVID-era shutdowns. The National Federation of Independent Business reported that nearly 4 in 10 small firms froze hiring, citing not just current tariffs, but the uncertainty of where rates would go next. A McKinsey survey revealed that 62% of CEOs across multiple industries delayed major expansion or acquisition decisions, explicitly referencing the unpredictability of Trump's tariff regime. These were not isolated cases. General Electric halted plans to expand its turbine plant in Indiana. Home Depot pulled $60 million worth of appliance orders off its supply chain forecast. This wasn't policy friction. It was economic paralysis. Without clear tariff timelines, pricing structures collapsed. Contracts stalled. Retailers couldn't plan seasonal inventories. Exporters couldn't price overseas deals. And investors, wary of rapid swings in rules and retaliation, began pulling back capital. Trump had hoped tariffs would intimidate competitors and rally domestic production. Instead, they frightened American businesses into a prolonged holding pattern, undermining exactly the economic engine he claimed he was protecting. Now it has become clear that Trump is desperate. In one instance, he wants cooperation, and in the other, he decides to get offensive. Now, after trying every option, Trump has paused tariffs for 90 days. A leaked Treasury Department memo, obtained by Reuters, revealed just how dire the internal projections had become. According to the memo, if Trump's tariff trajectory continued unchecked, core inflation was on track to breach 5% by July, and annual consumer spending was projected to shrink by over $200 billion. That wasn't a mild downturn. It was the beginning of a self-inflicted recession. Faced with mounting pressure, Trump stood before the press on April 15th and announced what he framed as a 90-day pause on the majority of tariffs, a gesture, he claimed, of diplomatic flexibility to give countries time to negotiate in good faith. But no one missed the real story. This wasn't a calculated pause. It was a panic stop, the economic equivalent of yanking the emergency brake while barreling down the highway. And even that pause came poisoned. Rather than easing uncertainty, the White House compounded it with an ultimatum. If no deals were reached within 90 days, the 50% reciprocal tariffs would snap back automatically. There was no new negotiating framework, no clearly defined criteria for success, no enforcement guidance for trade partners, just a fresh deadline wrapped in the same chaos, more of a pressure bomb than a peace offer. The markets, already volatile, flinched again. The Dow erased its brief recovery. Treasury yields spiked. Bond markets saw a return of volatility not seen since the early days of the pandemic. Businesses didn't trust the pause. They feared what would happen on day 91. Consumers didn't believe prices would fall because retailers had already warned that costs were locked in through quarter 3. Foreign governments didn't see sincerity. They saw an administration struggling to avoid political embarrassment under the weight of its own bluff. Trump, who had branded tariffs as tools of power, had just pulled them back, not in victory, but in crisis containment. The image of strength cracked, replaced by a retreat disguised as strategy, and a credibility hole that no press conference could patch. Perhaps the most damning part of the tariff war wasn't the economic damage, but the global silence that followed. After all the letters, the threats, the deadlines, the world didn't panic. It didn't beg. It simply moved on. On May 1st, EU officials confirmed that no formal responses had been issued to the White House's tariff letters, not because they were crafting counteroffers, but because they saw no point. Brussels had already begun deepening internal trade integration with Asia and Africa, shifting focus to more stable partners. Japan, too, had been in advanced discussions with U.S. negotiators until the letters arrived. Overnight, they suspended talks indefinitely, citing unacceptable volatility in terms. Elsewhere, India's foreign ministry issued a rare public rebuke, stating that unilateral tariff notices are not a basis for sustainable international trade. This came just weeks after Trump's team had boasted that India was close to finalizing a deal. Clearly, the political realities on the ground were very different from what Trump was projecting in interviews. Inside the U.S., the cracks were just as visible. Gary Cohn, Trump's former National Economic Council director, said in a scathing CNBC interview, he thought governments pay tariffs. They don't. American businesses do. That fundamental misunderstanding undercuts the entire approach. And that's precisely what had happened. Trump mistook economic intimidation for strategy. He believed unilateral action would force foreign governments to bend. But instead of collapsing under pressure, they simply shifted their alliances, diversified their supply chains, and in some cases, actively began building trade structures without the U.S. at the table. Trade, it turns out, is not a battlefield. It's a network. And when you treat your network like an opponent, you don't dominate it. You get disconnected. As China quietly expanded its role in regional trade, the EU advanced carbon border tax negotiations, and BRICS nations built alternatives to SWIFT and the dollar, the vacuum Trump created began filling, just not in America's favor. In the end, the most strategic thing the world did was nothing at all. They didn't retaliate. They just left. What do you think? Was it stupid of Trump to give an ultimatum to 150 countries at the same time? Isn't it true that if he had done it with 10 to 20 countries, the United States was in the position to fight? But now, confronting over 150 countries at the same time is impossible. In the comment section below, share your thoughts on the possibility that Trump will have no option but to cancel the ultimatum, not out of mercy, but to save face. Do you want to watch more videos like this one? If yes, subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon next to it. We bring the latest news stories on geopolitics, economics, changing world order, and current affairs. Things you need to stay informed. Thanks for watching, and until the next video, stay tuned.